Welcome to the Sports Card Professor. I'm Darren, and today I want to defend the junk wax era. I want to defend the term and really the era, because I've heard a few people recently say that we need to kind of get rid of the name because they don't like the name. They don't like the connotations that the name have for the era. And in all likelihood, that was probably their time of coming up as collectors. And they look back at it with nostalgia, and they don't want for it to have the aura that it wasn't an awesome time to collect cards, because it was. I think the problem that they have is that they're misunderstanding what the junk wax era refers to, or maybe everybody does. And so I wanted to add some clarity to what I've already explained what the junk wax era is. I've done a whole video that talks about it. And I left a few things out in order to really make sure that everything came through clearly. But I want to talk about what the term junk wax era specifically refers to, and how I think that people are confusing that term with the way that you really describe the cards, because the junk wax era actually does not describe the cards of that era. It describes collectors and the response that companies had. So eras are not an all-encompassing affair. It's not like an era defines everything that happens underneath it. It's an umbrella term, and you can have multiple umbrellas focusing on different aspects of a subject. In cards, there are only a couple of distinct eras. There are 4 distinct eras that I recognize of the pre-war era, the post-war early modern era, the 90s, and then the new millennium. Those 4 eras distinguish the different phases that the card industry went through. And there's also a term called vintage cards, and there's a vintage era. And the vintage era continues into somewhere between the mid-70s and the late 80s. And most of us feel that it's somewhere between about 1980 and 1989. And it's kind of a nebulous concept of exactly where that lines up. So even that term it kind of goes by the way that particular people feel the term should apply. But vintage cards overlaps both pre-war and post-war cards. So you have 2 completely different eras that are existing at the same time because they're fulfilling different roles. And that's the key to understanding eras, periods. They are to distinguish something that happened. In architecture, for instance, you have, say, the Victorian era. Well, the Victorian era has multiple styles. So you can look at a building and say that's Victorian, but that's not the style. That's just the period of time when the building was created. It happened to be created during the reign of Queen Victoria. And there are a lot of things that happened during that time that had kind of a general feel, but styles are different from eras. Art Deco is the same way. You can look at a building that's Art Deco, and it can be either highest style Art Deco, like the skyscrapers in New York City, or it can be streamlined modern, or there are different ways that you can look at an era or of styles, periods, etc. And sometimes you can look at an era in one way, and you can look at that same period of time and see a different era going on because you're looking at a different aspect of it. And so in card collecting, there are different ways that we want to look at the evolution of cards. And when you look at the junk wax era, what you're looking at is an event. It's not a particular stylistic time. I mean, the first portion of the junk wax era is wildly different from the last era. A 1989 card shares nothing at all from 1991. You could say, well, what about Fleer and Don Russ? Okay, if you nitpick, you can find some little details. But 89 and 91 are like a decade apart. It is a remarkably vast amount of change that happened in that short period of time because of the activities that were going on. And the activities were based on collectors. We came in full force, but more importantly than that, we got a whole new generation of card collectors that came in, flooded the market, added a bunch of money and a bunch of enthusiasm. And the card market responded. The card companies started printing more, and that's what we normally talk about with the junk wax era, but they also did something else, actually 2 things. They also broadened the market and improved the market. So when the junk wax era started, yes, we had lots of boxes, but within just a couple of years, we had tons and tons and tons and tons of brands and companies that entered into the market. So Pacific, Proline, Wildcard, Collector's Edge, Playoff. You like these cards? Guess why they're there? Even Upper Deck, they're there because the market was broad enough to handle all of this market. And the market was strong enough that they could invest in coming into the card market. Plus premium brands, Ultra, Pinnacle, SP. These card brands which were, well, these card sets that were part of a brand, they continued to broaden out the market. So we got lots of different options. And the card technology improved incredibly. We had gold foil all over the place, high gloss cards. We had etched metal. I mean, it was amazing the things they were able to add to cards because of the surge of interest and money into the market. It's a different surge than we've seen in the COVID era. The COVID era is kind of a weird mess, but that's going to be a whole nother discussion that we're going to have to be able to look back on and actually see how the market changed afterwards. But with the junk wax era, the point of the junk wax era is that we had so many people that came in, rushed in, got really involved, bought a bunch of stuff, and then a huge percentage of that group left. They just disappeared. Some of the people who left were people who'd already been in the market and then they got burned out. Other people came in because the party was raging, and then when the party started to wane, they lost interest and they left. Some people, like myself, I came in during the junk wax era, and I've been here ever since. So for me, I have the nostalgia of this time because this was where I started. But I've never looked at this in any negative way, because to me, the junk wax era, it was an event. That's all it was. It was a period of time when we had tons of card shows, tons of card shops, and tons of options all of a sudden. Everything was expanding. But for those of us who stuck around when the party ended, look, the card market continued like it had been. Less card shows, less card shops, that's fine. There were less cards to buy, that's fine. But the card industry felt pretty much the same way. And so when we look back at that era, what we remember is the fun of collecting cards in 1990 in the same way that we remember them collected in 1995. And that's because the cards themselves didn't change. There was an evolution that was going on, sure. But when you look at the junk wax era, which is late 80s to early 90s, what you're looking at is what I just said. You're looking at the late 80s and you're looking at the early 90s. The 80s basically ended about 88 and 89. 89 was a transitional year, and the 1990 was the first year of the 90s. Not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of technology. You had some of the 80s creeping into as late as 1991, but for the most part, 1990 was pretty much a line right in the sand. And before that, everything was older, which is why a lot of people consider that to be vintage. And just afterwards, everything was just so much fresher, so much more new. And when you look at the cards in 1991, they don't, like I said, they don't share anything from 1989. They're totally different. So if you're talking about a Ken Griffey Jr. rookie card, you're talking about an 80s card. That's what you're looking at. Late 80s, yes, but you're looking at an 80s card. If you're looking at a Frank Thomas rookie card, you're actually looking at a 90s card. It really does, very few of the cards share anything with the Ken Griffey Jr. rookie cards. Okay, over in baseball, there was a little bit more. So let's shift that. If you look at a Barry Sanders rookie card, that's an 80s card. That's a late 80s card. If you look at a Brett Favre rookie card, that's an early 90s card, and they're nothing alike. That's the key. The key is that you're looking at two distinct different eras. Now, we happen to be collecting at that time where it kind of bridged over the line. So if you were collecting in 88 and 89, and then you continued into 91, you look at that all as one thread of your collecting experience, which is great. But that's your nostalgia. That happens to align with the events of the junk wax era, meaning the people who came flooding in. But the actual eras related to cards are the 80s and the 90s. That's really the eras that relate to the cards. When people think of the junk wax era, they think of the overproduction. And the term really does imply that. And you really can't shake that, but I don't think that you should. I don't think that there is a problem with the term junk wax era, as long as you remember it's not about the cards. It's about the quantities, yes. But if all you care about a card is its value, then you don't care about the cards. You really don't. And that's your own issue. But if you care about cards, look, junk wax has nothing to do with the cards themselves. They are standalone entities. And so if you use the term junk wax, you're actually misrepresenting what you're trying to talk about. You need to talk about the stylistic aspect of the cards. You need to talk about the technology of the cards, and those are based on the two decades themselves. The junk wax is actually a really important and really impressive period of time because it birthed cards as we know it today. It would have happened at some point. That was pretty much inevitable. But the amount of activity, which yes, caused an amazing amount of overproduction, it also happened to align with an amazing amount of innovation. They were hand in hand. If we didn't have the overproduction, we wouldn't have had the innovation. That's how it works. And so if you're concerned with the fact that people are looking at junk wax and thinking that it means junk, stop using the term. Talk about late 80s and talk about early 90s. But the junk wax era has actually given us a unique gift, which is when I collected Pro Set cards in 1990, every pack was 50 cents. Well, now every pack is actually pretty close to 50 cents. And for kids, there aren't very many packs that are affordable, which means that these cards, which are still in tremendous abundance, are actually affordable to kids. So now kids have the ability to discover the same cards that I discovered, learn about cards from the same place I did. This magical land way off in the distance when football had punters and offensive linemen that apparently they're not a part of the game anymore because they don't show up in sets. Back then they did. And they had sets that were built to be sets. They had interesting subsets that were thematic, and it really helped you to see the whole landscape of the sport. And card design, that was a time when card design was built around the sport. It was not built around the flashiness of a player who you can put on a fantasy team. It was actually built around a team and the action of the game. You look at 1991 Action Pack, that is straight up action. I mean, it literally, the action's coming right off the card. The shots are focused right in, so you're looking at the player and really seeing the player. That's the way the cards are designed. They're designed for collectors. More importantly, they're designed for fans of the sport. And so the fact is, this is actually sitting there for people to discover today the way that they had in the past. The junk wax era, the overproduction of it, is not a curse. I mean, if you dumped a bunch of money into it and lost it, yes, then it's a curse. But at the end of the day, it's actually a blessing in disguise because it has frozen a window of time such that you can experience it today. I would love to be able to open up a pack of cards from when my dad was a kid, but I'd have to take out a second mortgage to be able to do that. But for my kids, well, I don't have any, but for the kids of people my age, they can. They actually can. So it's a way of thinking of it. You can either be down on it and look at it and say, well, junk wax means that it's junk. Or you can look at it as this is a period of time that went from the strange card design, the unique card designs of the late 80s into the unique and very impressive card designs of the early 90s. You can look at it in that way. And if that's the way that you're referring to it, then people are going to look at the card designs and appreciate the cards for what they are. Are they not worth a fortune? That's fine. Who cares? The cards are really amazing. So that's the way I'd like for people to think about it. And even the moniker of junk wax, it's not necessarily that negative. For many of you on this channel, quite a few, you like me are part of Generation X. Now, Gen X is, it's a name that's actually a placeholder. The whole concept is baby boomers started making these generation names. And so they were the baby boomers, and the generation before was the greatest generation. And they looked at us and they said, well, we don't know what you're going to be yet. So you're generation fill in the blank. So that's what we are, Generation X. And then there was Gen Y, and then Generation Y actually got a definition. So they became millennials. And Gen X still didn't get the generational distinction, which it's led us to be the forgotten generation, which is very indicative of the generation. It's the same, we're basically like K2. Could you change the name Gen X? You could, but why? It's actually very accurate, very descriptive. And I imagine that for some people they don't like it, but for me, I wear it as a badge of honor. I'm proud of myself. I don't look at my generation as a failure. It's just that that's the way that things happen to lay out. And so it depends on how you look at it. When I look at the junk wax era, I look at a great time that just happened to, by circumstance, freeze a time that is precious to me. And when I look back at basically my own childhood as a collector, and I see that time frozen in time, I am so excited that it continues to exist. These great cards continue to be discovered, and they're easily accessible. So many cards are difficult for anybody to get their hands on unless they really try hard. Everybody can have these cards. That's one of the great things about them, is that they're great card designs, great sets that anybody can access. So I wish that people would take more pride in the junk wax era. And again, if you're not into the term junk wax era, then stop talking about it and talk about specifically the late 80s and the early 90s, because there's no reason you should be talking about a 1989 card and then a 1991 card in the same breath, unless you're comparing them, because they're wildly different. That's kind of the key to me, is do look at these cards for what they are. And the cards themselves are a part of a whole nother era, a whole nother aspect of card collecting. So that's kind of the way that I wanted to look at this and kind of bounce it off of people and get a feel for it. I at least wanted to get that out there, get out my personal perspective, and hopefully it'll help some people out. I don't know. It's, if nothing else, it is a perspective that can help a broader conversation if we ever do have one. But I hope that we don't come up with names like the classic era or anything like that, because if you want to talk about that, the high era of card collecting was that time, but it lasted from about the mid 80s through the better part of the 90s. It's a much broader umbrella than just the junk wax era. So yeah, definitely let me know in the comments below your take on it, your view of it, and I am kind of curious to hear kind of what people think. If nothing else, thanks for sticking around and listening to it, because it certainly makes me feel a lot better. So other than that, the typical house cleaning, if you haven't subscribed, definitely do so. Check out my other videos, because this is my wheelhouse. This is exactly what I focus on. Other than that, yeah, thank you very much for watching.